Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. COVID-19 came from a wet market. The Trump campaign colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 election. The Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. Big tech did not censor conservatives in the 2020 election. President Biden knew nothing about his son's business dealings. The Afghanistan withdrawal was a success, and the border is under control. These are some of the lies that have corroded the United States of America over the past few years. Developments like these have led to what author Gerard Baker calls, quote, a pathology of distrust, end quote, among American citizens. Today, I am pleased to welcome Mr. Baker, who has authored a new book on this subject, American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions and How We Can Rebuild Confidence. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless and the Julie Hartman YouTube channel in general. You can catch Dennis and Julie, my show with Dennis Prager, right here on this channel every Monday. It premieres at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern, and of course you can catch Timeless Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays also right here on this channel at the same time, 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. It is great, as always, to be with you. And it is great to be with Gerard Baker today. He is an editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal, the editor-at-large, I should say, of the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Baker previously served as the editor-in-chief of the Journal and Dow Jones from 2013 to 2018. Before joining the Journal, Mr. Baker reported for the Times of London, the Financial Times, and the BBC. Mr. Baker has a weekly column in the Journal called Free Expression, and also hosts a podcast by that name where he interviews every week many leading writers and thinkers about a variety of subjects. His recent book is American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions and How We Can Rebuild Confidence. Hello, Mr. Baker. Sorry, I'm supposed to call you Jerry. You told me before the interview. Welcome to Timeless.
Julie, thank you very much indeed for having me. It's a pleasure.
What an important book, and what an important time to write this book. As I mentioned in the introduction, it seems that we have kind of been bombarded by a lot of lies here in the United States over the past few years. And if there's one thing that both the Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on, it is this distrust in our institutions. I understand that this is a pretty broad question to start off with, but when do you really see the tides turning and this pathology of distrust, as you say, starting?
Well, you laid out very well, actually, in your introduction there, Julie, before we started talking, some of the kind of events, some of the claims, some of the misrepresentations that have been made over the last 20 years or so that have certainly contributed in significant way to the decline in public trust that people have in our institutions. And when I talk about our institutions, I mean the media. Obviously, we are very familiar with that, and your viewers and listeners will be very familiar with why the media has forfeited the trust of people. But I also mean, and I look at these in the book, the government, the permanent government, law enforcement, universities, academic institutions, institutions of regular education, of K through 12 education, big business, technology companies, even public health institutions and science institutions have been. There's been a catastrophic decline in trust over the last 30 years, as measured by various polls, and as we can just see in terms of our public discourse. I mean, how this began, this again, it's quite striking. As I say, the Gallup organization, which conducts these regular surveys, has been asking people every year for about 50 years whether or not they have a high level of trust or a low level of trust in all of these big institutions. And we've seen this trust really start to decline rapidly. It started really in the late 1990s. At the end of the Cold War, America was in a pretty good place. The country had, won the Cold War. It seemed to be, we were entering into a sort of a new period where we thought everybody sort of agreed on the basic parameters of life, and America was doing politics, and America seemed to be doing very well. And then, really beginning around that time, the late 90s, a number of things went on. I think there are lots of reasons I give in the book to explain why the various institutions lost trust government. You mentioned the Iraq War. I think that was a huge factor in terms of in terms of undermining people's trust in the government and what the government told them. The financial crisis of 2008 was something else that contributed to a loss of trust in finance and big business and other institutions. Various other media has been, frankly, forfeiting trust over a very long period of time through false stories, false claims. The thing I identify in the book, I identify some common factors across all these institutions. And I think the most important one, and again, this helps to date this process probably, was the kind of seizure of the major institutions by this sort of progressive left elite that we have in this country, which really kind of took off in the kind of 1990s and really accelerated in the early 2000s. And this elite, they subscribe to a kind of a credo of views on things like race and gender and climate change and things like globalization, the importance of a world without borders. All of these ideas that really are very much at odds with the views of what have been traditional views, the traditional values of America, and what I would argue, the traditional values that have made this country great: a belief in individual liberty and a belief in the nation, the importance of the nation state and what it stands for. So I think it's this a long cultural process that began accelerating in the 1990s and has just continued ever since.
I recently interviewed Bill O'Reilly on Timeless about his new book, Killing the Witches. And we had an interesting discussion about whether or not what happened in 1692 in Puritan Massachusetts was inevitable, because the society was so austere, so religiously fanatical, that at least it kind of seemed to me that something like that event was somewhat bound to occur. Moving this now to the situation in the United States of America, to your point, Mr. Baker, Jerry. See, I was raised to be very polite and deferential to adults. Nowadays, people aren't so much, so it's taking adjustment.
You're very old-fashioned. It's very commendable. But,
yes.
These days.
Yes, I'm a traditionalist.
By the way, for someone like me who was born in England, I was certainly brought up in that sort of deferential politesse. But these days, no. I'm very happy to be on first name terms with everybody.
As a total aside, growing up, there were these schools here in Los Angeles where I was raised and went to school, where students as young as 5 and 6 years old were allowed to call teachers by their first names.
Right.
And I was so allergic to that I've probably taken it too far, and now I'm 23 years old and still call adults Mr. or Mrs. so-and-so, but forgive me. So my question is, we were talking about how the witch trials might have been inevitable in Puritan Massachusetts. Do you think that this kind of corruption of institutions is an inevitable product of affluence and leisure that we've achieved in the United States?
It's an interesting question. I think there is something to that, and I could talk a little bit about it. I think it's a product to some extent of the end of the Cold War. I mean, I think it's a tremendous. It will rank as one of the great ironies and paradoxes of history that, having spent 50 years pretty well of the Cold War in this kind of existential struggle, ideological struggle for for our values, for our ideals against authoritarian, totalitarian communism, which, by the way, followed existential struggle against authoritarian, totalitarian fascism in a hot war, and the struggle against various other ideologies, including, but you could go back and you can talk about, the history of America. Obviously, it's obviously a very important 19th century, the Civil War, which was a war fought and won again in the interest of the principle of human dignity and freedom. So, having won all these tremendous wars, these tremendous fights over 200 years of its history, the United States in the early 1990s, it basically defeated all comers, defeated all ideological all comers, had established a superiority of its system of the idea of liberal democracy. It then seemed to turn on itself and decide that actually the greatness of America, the achievements of America, were not actually great at all. Were not really achievements at all. And this is where this kind of, I don't like the term woke, by the way, because it's sort of rather lazy, but everybody kind of knows what it means. So it's quite useful to use. But this is where this sort of woke revolution came about. And I think and I do think whether it was inevitable, I think very few things in history are inevitable, except, as the famous words, death and taxes are the only things that are inevitable. Whether it was inevitable or not, I don't know. But I think it did come out, and I think part of what you're saying came out of an era of relative affluence. Again, extraordinary, in addition to the political successes that we had and the cultural success we had for our political system in the 20th century. We also had astonishing success for capitalism, for our economic system. So we did reach a sort of point, famous end of history moment, as Francis Fukuyama famously called it, where we did seem to have reached, we sort of established again the sort of unimpeachable supremacy of the American free system, the free market, free people's system. And I think that masked, to some extent, the kind of, first of all, the ways in which perhaps the American system had actually been failing people to some extent. I think I'm quite intrigued by this idea that liberalism has kind of failed. I think there is something to that in the way that it actually creates a kind of sense of nothingness in people's lives. We've replaced religion with the pursuit of sort of the idea of liberalism, of liberty, which in itself is is actually a sort of an empty doctrine. So I do think, I think you could argue that this collapse we've seen in the cohesion of trust that is necessary for any society to exist, the collapse we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years, again, I wouldn't say it's necessarily inevitable, but it is the outcome of this. Again, the ironic outcome, if you like, of this position that the United States had got itself into, where it had essentially defeated all other rivals to its own ideology. And so then what happened is, as I say, these institutions, the powerful institutions in the country, were seized by people who had a radically different view of American history and of American values, and that, which came essentially out of the universities in the 1960s and 70s, came to embrace this sort of woke ideology, and that, I think, is a product of the again, the position that the United States had reached by the end of the 20th century.
That is an astute point, that a la Francis Fukuyama's end of history hypothesis, that the Western liberal order seemed to have triumphed in the 1990s. And because, as you say, we defeated all other challenges to our ideology, we sort of engaged in this cannibalism.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, I do think it's also, I think one very important thing is that a lot of this, the sort of cultural revolution that we've witnessed in the last 25 years over race, gender, the nation state, globalization, the collapse of religion. I think one thing, by the way, very important in this is the steady decline and then sort of increasingly rapid collapse of organized religion. The number of Americans say that they adhere to religion. That kind of the cultural revolution, that has replaced some of those values, in particular religion. We should remember it came out of. It did have its antecedents, its roots in the Marxism of the Cold War period and before. And that, again, one of the ironies is that Marxism, which was primarily economic in its interpretation, the idea that we lived in societies that were essentially the product of of competing power systems. In the economic model, this was the power of the capitalists and the managers over the proletariat, and the proletariat were being oppressed. This was a story of power and oppression. Proletariat were oppressed by the economic masters. That was when everybody could see very clearly for themselves at the end of the Cold War that the communist ideology, the Marxist ideology, had failed completely, and that idea of Marxist economic oppression had failed. Instead of I think sort of the Marxists kind of going away and just accepting that was just a completely wrong analytical framework, they shifted their attention to. It maintained the same basic concept, the same sort of structural concept that society is based on oppressive oppression and power systems that operate that oppression, and they kind of just shifted it to the kind of cultural, social, racial field. So it became the oppressive class was no longer the capitalists oppressing the proletariat with their ownership of the means of production and distribution and exchange. It was the history of white patriarchal oppressive white supremacists, and then we got this whole idea of intersectionality that came out of it. And I think that the power of that idea in these elite organizations, again, I say beginning in our universities, really beginning in the sort of 60s, 70s, and 80s, even as the Cold War was ending, and then really coming to fruition and educating all these people who came of age, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and beyond, and people of your generation now, and you know this very well, having just recently graduated from university, these ideas of oppression and the fundamental inequity and injustice of the U.S. system have been, essentially inculcated into our the generation below mine and above yours in particular, and they have become the people who have taken control of these institutions and have driven these institutions in a direction, as I say, towards values that I think most Americans don't accept. So I think it's a very interesting economic, cultural, social revolution that's been taking place. But that's, I think, why we've got to the position where people no longer trust them.
I totally agree with you that wokeism, I also agree it's sort of a lazy term that I try to avoid, but it's effective in conveying the point. I agree with you that wokeism, that radical left-wing progressive ideology about class, race, and gender has infiltrated into our institutions, whether it's our education system, our police system, even our military, and it has caused this pathology of distrust. However, there are some earlier events, I would call them antecedents to the bigger collapse of trust that didn't, at least to me, seem to have anything to do with wokeism, or they predated wokeism. For instance, the 2008 financial crisis and also the Iraq War. To what do you attribute those catastrophes? Because again, wokeism didn't really exist back then. So what happened to make those such a colossal failure?
Well, I think that's a very good point, Julie. You make a very good point. You're absolutely right. This isn't the kind of woke revolution does not explain the entire collapse in trust. One of the things I talk about in the book is a lot of it is to do with performance, the performance of these institutions, and the performance overall of the authorities, if you like, of the leading authorities, of the leading lights in the United States, economic, political, cultural, and the fact that they have failed. They failed the American people so many times over the last 2 decades. You're absolutely right. The Iraq War, I think, is I'm, by the way, I speak as someone who at the time actually supported the Iraq War. I thought it was right. I believed the arguments about weapons of mass destruction. I believed the arguments that it was necessary to deal with the potential threat from Saddam Hussein. But I think it became very clear very quickly to me, and I think to the vast majority of Americans now, that in fact, that was, I don't, by the way, necessarily believe the Bush administration lied about it, but it was the most terrible miscalculation. I think one of the worst foreign policy miscalculations the United States has made. You're absolutely right. There's nothing to do with woke. George W. Bush was about as far from woke as you could possibly get. But that just reflected a failure of decision making, and also to some extent a failure of honesty and integrity. Because while again, I don't think the administration would knowingly lied, I think it did get us into a war on the basis of a false premise, and that created tremendous mistrust. The financial crisis, exactly as you say, again, not a woke phenomenon, but something again that represented an enormous failure of our kind of ruling class, a failure of our economic system to some extent. I mean, again, this was the point in 2007, 2008, where kind of everybody believed that sort of neoliberal economic model capitalism was basically the perfect system. It could be it could create problems here and there, but it wasn't fundamentally flawed. Along came the financial crisis, revealed that it was fundamentally flawed, and much worse, I think, in practical political terms and in terms of the way people trusted or didn't trust their institutions. We had this crashing of the economy, the crashing of the financial system, tens of millions of Americans in financial distress, millions of Americans lost their jobs. And yet somehow the people who were responsible for this crisis, those in the financial sector, those who led the financial sector, didn't seem to pay the price. I mean, some of them lost money, some of them lost their jobs. But within years, banks were back to being as big as they'd ever been. In fact, they're bigger than they ever were. Their shareholders were rewarded as much as they'd ever been. Their chief executives and other top executives were rewarded. There was a real sense of betrayal there, I think, that we had been led, and Americans have been led into this terrible economic abyss by these people who then didn't seem to pay the price. That undermined trust too. And I think more broadly, and one final thing I'd say on this, is the economic performance over the last 20 years. US economic performance has been very disappointing in the last 20 years compared with the previous 20 years, or indeed any 20-year period in the last 150 years, pretty much. That economic growth has been relatively stagnant, productivity has been weak, the economy has not been as dynamic as it was. We've allowed these big, this is one part of the thing I talk in the book about, the power of big businesses and how they've established for themselves huge monopolistic power, huge advantage for themselves at the expense of workers, at the expense of the larger economy. We've lost competitiveness, we've lost dynamism, and as a result, we've lost productive potential. And I think that's been another fact. So people look at that. They look at what does that mean in practical terms. If you're an average American worker on a median wage, it means you've had no real wage increases over the last 20 years. Your standard of living has declined. You ask Americans whether they think their children are going to have a better life than they are. For the first time, this generation of Americans answers in overwhelming numbers that they don't think the future for their country, for their children, is going to be better than the life that they've had. That's unheard of in America. America is this great optimistic country where everybody always thinks they can improve and that their children are going to have a better life. People don't believe that anymore. So yes, you're absolutely right, Julie. It's, you know, the seizure of these institutions in this context by these kind of progressive, liberal, left-wing elites, whatever you want to call them, is an important factor. But it comes in that context of essentially repeated failures that have really, really left many, many, many Americans disillusioned about the institutions that drive their country.
Yes, and the preceding failures contributed to the self-cannibalism. I said earlier cannibalism. What I meant to say was self-cannibalism that we're seeing now with the advent of wokeism. Before we continue with Jerry, see, I did it. I became impolite officially. I'd like to quickly tell you about MyPillow. I use many MyPillow products. I walk into work every day wearing my slippers before I put on my heels. I sleep on the MyPillow, the Giza Dream bed sheets, and I use my towels. And you can too, at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman. For a limited time, you'll receive 60% off of the Giza Dream bed sheets. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square and use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745. And you guessed it, use the promo code Hartman to get discounts on many MyPillow products. As I said, I use these products. I wouldn't advertise them if I didn't think that you should use them too. So please do go check that out. So one of the things, Jerry, that really concerns me, in addition to the woke infiltration of our institutions, the mistrust among Americans, not just with regard to our institutions, but with each other, as you point out in your book, and I appreciate. You know, something that really worries me in addition to that, when institutions are proven to have lied, Americans don't seem to care. It's kind of staggering to me. For instance, we saw with Black Lives Matter, everyone supported Black Lives Matter. And then it came out that they were embezzling millions of dollars to buy mansions in Los Angeles instead of giving that money to poor Black Americans who needed it. No one cared. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics about a year ago published that in the second economic quarter, the Biden administration created 1 million jobs, and then they retracted it and said, oh, whoops, we actually meant 10,000. No one seemed to care. No one seemed to care when, and I know that, you know, a lot of people have very strong feelings about January 6th, putting that aside, but no one seemed to care when Tucker Carlson released the footage of Jacob Chansley being escorted through the Capitol by 9 different Capitol police officers. People didn't care that the January 6th committee didn't show the American people that footage. And so it's startling that in this epidemic of mistrust or distrust, there also seems to be this jadedness, this sense of resignation that when institutions are corrupt, people don't care. Why do you think that is? And how do we change that?
Well, I think that's partly true. I don't entirely agree with you. I mean, I don't think it's true that people don't care. I think one of the things, and again, when I talk about the chapter in the book where I look at mutual mistrust and the way in which Americans trust in each other, perhaps most alarmingly, has declined, a lot of that is down to the massive increase in polarization and partisanship that we have. So when you say people don't care, when the Biden administration says things about the economy that turn out to be true, you know, a lot of people don't care, and the Biden administration supporters in the media don't seem to take it very seriously. But I think a lot of people, you know, who are conservative, who don't
Fair
favor Joe
enough.
Biden, who are Republican, care very strongly, and in fact they cite it all the time. Or if they, Biden's laptop, or or the Russia collusion story, all of these things, people, it's actually a heavily motivating factor for those who oppose him. Or January the 6th for people on the Democratic side who that they do care about that. It's a highly motivating factor for them. So this is the problem. One of the core problems we have is that, for a variety of reasons, which I don't go into in too much detail in the book because it's been very well rehearsed, but for a variety of reasons, America has become just a very, very polarized society, and this is so reflected, Julie, as you'll be very well aware, in the media, and that we now just basically have media that essentially reflects one version of events against another version of events. There's no such thing. I would argue the Wall Street Journal strives to continue to do this, but most other news organizations don't even really try anymore to kind of try and give you, the truth, try and find out the truth. They give their readers or their viewers or their listeners what they want to hear. So if you've got a particular, if you're a progressive, if you're someone of a left-wing viewpoint, you're kind of woke and all of those things, you'll like the New York Times. You'll read the New York Times, you'll like the New York Times' stories. If you are conservative and you don't like any of that stuff and you want to know about the border and what's going on with immigration and what's going on, with the sort of corruption in government, then you'll look at Fox News, or you'll read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal and so on, or listen to your podcast. So, I mean, that's part of the problem here, that we don't have, and I wrote this in the book, it's not so much that people have talked about a post-truth society where we don't, where there's no such thing as, we kind of into sort of this postmodern idea that we don't really have truth anymore because one political view holds one point, has one quote unquote truth, and the other has another truth. I argue in the book that's not quite right. What we have is a kind of two-truth society. There are we have become so tribal in our identification with our political ideology and our political party that we choose the facts, the information, the truth, if you like, that aligns with our ideological and political interests, and we reject any truth, any facts, anything that challenges that. And that's really, really dangerous. And that's why people don't trust each other. And, there is lots of polling, and again, I talk about this in the book, that Americans now view each other disturbingly. I mean, partisan Republicans and Democrats view each other in terms of the way they think about their trustworthiness. They view each other in the way that Israelis and Palestinians view each other. It's a particularly germane and relevant and topical point at the moment. But if you think about the implications of that for the cohesion of society, that is very disturbing. So that's, again, there are thousands of books have been written about polarization and what we need to do to tackle it. There are institutional changes in others, but that is a really severe problem, that we have a country that essentially is bifurcated in the way it thinks about truth and the way it thinks about the facts and the way it thinks about reality.
Yes, and the media, as you say, is in large part to blame for that. On a final note, what role do you see the aristocracy, as I kind of call them, playing in this? Allow me to explain. There are a lot of people, and I kind of grew up in this milieu here in Los Angeles and going to Harvard, who have really ascended thanks to the meritocratic system here in the United States, and made massive amounts of money, been incredibly successful, and kudos to them. They've done a great job. However, I see a lot of these people sort of turning their meritocracy, into an aristocracy, where they try to kind of pad things for their children so that their children can have the same level of affluence that they do. And I think because they think that they have earned their wealth and they have earned their status, that they don't really have a responsibility to make sure that things run properly in society. They kind of luxuriate in their affluence. What role do you see those individuals playing in the demise of this trust?
Really important. I mean, you raise a really, really good point there, Julie. And again, I do talk about this a little bit in the book. I think that's hugely important. Look, you can tell from my accent, I hope, that I grew up in England. I'd lived in England for the first 30-something years of my life, lived elsewhere, and then I came to the United States in my mid-30s. I grew up in England in a very, very class-riddled society. I mean, everybody was very conscious of what class they occupied. Social mobility was pretty limited. If your parents went to university and had professional jobs, then you were very likely to follow them into that. If your parents didn't go to university, didn't have, particularly a set of, advanced degrees or anything like that, you grew up in a working class environment, the chances are you were going to be sort of likely to be sort of condemned to continue to live in that working class environment. Very hierarchical, very structured, very little social mobility. The United States, has been, although this can be overstated because America, of course, has never been a perfectly equal society, was much less like that, had, tremendous opportunities for social mobility. And indeed, again, harking back to the question we just talked about the way in which Americans view their future prospects for their children, for a century or more, Americans, believed in the American dream, that you could, wherever your background, you could make it big. This was what America was. You're absolutely right. And what we've seen in the last 25 years, and I think this is an important contributor to the decline in trust, is not only a massive increase in inequality, which of course we've seen, we know that, income inequality and wealth inequality, but we've seen a huge increase in inequality of opportunity. And exactly as you describe, you have this meritocracy. You were at Harvard, I think. You'll be very familiar with the work, and I quote him in my book, Professor Michael Sandel, who wrote a really good book a couple of years ago about the perils of a so-called meritocracy, or the myth of meritocracy. That exactly as you say, that we have this system where, you work hard and you do very well, and you go to one of the top schools, and then you can work for a big company, or you start out, you become you set up your own company and you make a fortune for yourself, and you've done it all yourself. Well, first of all, these days that isn't really true, because as we know, one of the most disturbing things we've seen is that in the last 30 years or so, if you look at the numbers of the admissions to the top university, to Ivy League, to the top 20, 30, 40 universities in this country, they are heavily skewed towards people who already come from very, very advantaged backgrounds. One of the things we found out with that extraordinary Supreme Court case that came up earlier this year about affirmative action at Harvard in particular, and other universities, but Harvard in particular, was not only that Harvard was actively discriminating, as we know, against Asian Americans. We also discovered, as we got a good opportunity to look through the numbers, we discovered that the vast majority of Harvard admissions come from people with incomes in the top 1 to 3% of the country. It's an extraordinary degree of self-perpetuating hierarchy. So that's a huge problem. And I think, again, this is a trust problem, because for many, many people, they just don't see they don't see the system as fair. They don't think, if you're a white working class kid who grew up in Ohio with a single parent and wasn't able to go to a particularly high performing school, and maybe you had a single parent who worked 2 jobs, your chances of getting on are relatively small. So there's the sense that there was fairness in the system, which is necessary for people to have trust in the system, that has been blown away in many respects. And even if we and again, sort of back to the affirmative action point, while we have seen in the last 30, 40 years, of course, massive expansion in the number of minorities that are going to universities, and in many ways, many people welcome that. Well, but one of the ironies of that is we've seen that increasingly that also favors the minorities who have themselves already done rather well. The children of those, many of the children of the minorities who get in, whether you want to call it affirmative action or whatever you want to describe to it, but who get into elite universities with somewhat lower scores, are often kids whose parents, are professionals themselves, who've done extremely well for themselves. So the problem we have here is not the problem we have at our universities, and the problem we have more generally in society, is not in particular now a lack of ethnic diversity or a lack of racial diversity. It's a lack of economic diversity. We really, really need to do more. And this is one very important thing we could do that would make the country a fairer place and establish a great level of trust, is to give much more access to university to people of whatever ethnic background who don't have the economic advantages that so many people who do get into these universities do have. So I completely agree with you. This sort of the kind of meritocracy, aristocracy, the irony of a meritocracy that's created an aristocracy shouldn't be lost on us.
And to your point, we see a lot of people now who are saying not just that they want to change who's in power in our government, but they want to change the government in general. They want to change the system. And with this breakdown of trust, with this failure of many of our institutions, people don't just see that the institutions have failed them, they think the system in general has failed them. So it shouldn't be shocking to us that we're seeing so many of these radical movements to overthrow capitalism, overthrow, certain systems. That I think is one of the biggest takeaways from your comments today in your book. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. No, but it's true. People, you're absolutely right. It's not just trust in the individual institutions or trust in each other. You're absolutely right. It's trust in the system itself. That should really concern us, because again, I just want to end on this note. I came here from Britain. America's a great country. It's done more for humanity than any other country, including my country of my own birth, which I'm also, proud to have been born a Brit. But I came to this country. I immigrated to the United States because I thought it's a great country. It's a great model, a great system, and it has done so much for its own people, but so many people. It's lifted people out of poverty. It's lifted people out of oppression around the world. And we seem somehow now, so many people no longer, but actually, by the way, on both the left and the right, don't really have any faith in it anymore. The left don't believe it because we're supposedly an oppressive, patriarchal, racist country, and the right don't believe it increasingly because they see the country as being run by woke ideologues who don't have any faith in the country anymore. That's a real challenge that we really have to work very hard to overcome.
Well, we can start by reading your book. As a reminder to the audience, Jerry's book is called American Breakdown. And please do look, if you haven't already, at his weekly column in the Wall Street Journal called Free Expression. At the risk of flattering you, Jerry, it's one of my favorites. And I read the editorial section religiously. Thank
you, Julie. That's extremely kind of you. And may I say how wise you are.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you for your time today.
No, thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for watching. I'll see you soon. Take care.